India's colleges produce some of the best graduates, but only a few of them have seen real factory floors or been inside a boardroom before starting a job. This startup wanted to bridge that gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. But this business, built entirely around a school calendar, learned a very expensive lesson about what happens when the calendar runs out of days. Its name, Purple Squirrel. Welcome back to The Flop Side, the podcast where we uncover the stories of Indian startups that once soared only to come crashing down. I'm your host Priyanka, and last week we watched a startup build the most sophisticated crypto trading engine India had ever seen, only to get strangled by an RBI circular that would eventually get overruled by the Supreme Court. This week, we're leaving behind screens and blockchains altogether and stepping into something a lot more physical. Industrial visits, factory tours, and the quiet panic of students who spend so much time, effort, and money on a degree and still graduate without a job in hand. We're talking about Purple Squirrel, a Mumbai-based edtech startup that tried to teach in the real world, taking college students out of their classrooms and putting them directly inside the companies they hoped to one day work for. This is the story of how a startup eventually crumbled under the pressure of exam season.
Act 1. The Spark.
In 2014, India's lead employability solutions company, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗙𝗹𝗶𝗲, published a document that shocked the country as it made national headlines. According to the National Employability Report for Engineers, out of over 120,000 students who graduated in 2013 from 520 plus engineering colleges across the country, less than 19% were deemed capable of being employed in the IT services sector. And for core engineering jobs, that number dropped down to single digits of around 3 to 7%. If you haven't heard that number before, I'm pretty sure you're strongly questioning it. How is it that a country producing engineers by the millions was producing job-ready engineers only by the handful? But this was not another self-reported survey or a casual academic poll. The data was anchored to the AMCAT, the Aspiring Minds Computer Adaptive Test, which served as India's largest and most heavily proctored standardized employability assessment. The evaluation didn't just skim the surface. It was a comprehensive audit of a graduate's actual capabilities, measuring everything from English communication and quantitative problem solving to highly specific domain knowledge across computer science, mechanical, electrical engineering. Most importantly, the definition of employable wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was calibrated directly by corporate India. At the time, AMCAT was the primary assessment engine for over 550 companies in the country, and the benchmark for passing was established through empirical validation of what cognitive skills and domain expertise were actually required for the job. So that 19% wasn't a pessimistic estimate. It was a statistically bulletproof reality check. The Indian education system was fundamentally misaligned with the industrial floor. And while academic boards debated incremental syllabus revisions that would take years to implement, two young professionals were already operating a startup designed to bypass the bureaucracy entirely and fix the issue at its root. But here's the fascinating thing. They hadn't set out to solve the macro skills gap crisis. They were reacting to something much more personal, a micro-psychological conflict. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗙𝗵𝗲, a Christ University gold medalist and financial analyst at 𝗧𝗵𝗲, has spent much of her college years deeply involved with ASEC, the Global Student Exchange and Leadership Network, interacting with students from more than 40 countries. It was then she developed a fascination with how young people evolve when you place them in unfamiliar high-stakes environments. And on the other hand, Aditya Gandhi, an IIT Bombay graduate with a master's degree who had gone on to work in Amsterdam as a derivatives and equities options trader, living and working in Europe gave him a front row seat to how seamlessly European education systems integrated structured industrial visits into the curricula. Together, they noticed, and I quote, an undercurrent of frustration in professionals of all age groups and industries around the professional choices they made. People were basically locking themselves into lifelong careers without ever seeing the inside of the companies they were joining. And this is exactly where the macro data and their micro observations collided. You can't be employable, and you certainly can't be fulfilled in an industry you've only ever read about in a textbook. So they decided the fix wasn't a better resume template or a smarter placement cell. It was giving students real exposure before they made their career decisions, not after. And thus, in September 2013, they founded Purple Squirrel EduVentures, incubated at the Society for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, that is IIT Bombay's own startup incubator. Describing their vision, they stated,
"We decided that a potential workforce that makes more informed choices by experiential learning and work culture immersion could and should be the future of our nation. That's the thought that set us about trying to achieve this paradigm shift in bridging the gap between the industry and academia."
Their approach deliberately stripped away the digital artifice that was beginning to define the early edtech boom. While other founders were busy pitching gamified apps, recorded lectures, and virtual simulations, Purple Squirrel's core product was the industrial visit itself. They chartered buses, they handed out hard hats, they planned single-day and week-long trips, pulling students out of their theoretical college bubbles and placing them directly inside the corporate boardrooms and manufacturing plants that match their specific disciplines. A chemical engineering student would tour an actual plant. A design student would sit inside an actual studio. It was learning by proximity, not by simulation, and it was something Indian college curricula had technically included for decades, but had not really bothered to make educational. Purple Squirrel took a broken checkbox academic requirement and turned it into a highly curated premium product.
Act 2. The Illusion.
The early traction validated their thesis almost immediately. Within roughly a year of operations, they were claiming more than 5,000 unique experiential learning experiences delivered in partnership with over 350 campuses and corporates, spanning more than a dozen destinations across the country. Crucially, they hadn't just sold this to the students. They had managed to crack the other side of the marketplace, the corporates. For the companies opening their doors, this wasn't just corporate social responsibility. It was highly targeted employer branding and a pipeline to observe emerging talent before placement season even began. In fact, Purple Squirrel's eventual plan was to place students directly into these partner companies and even earn a headhunting commission for it. The promise of their pitch was enough to catch the eye of India Quotient, the seed stage venture fund known for backing scrappy, capital-efficient Indian consumer businesses. and they came in as Purple Squirrel's first institutional investor in August 2014. For a company with no flashy app to demo and no viral growth loop to point to, that kind of early belief from a credible seed investor was a meaningful validation. Because Purple Squirrel wasn't just chasing a hypothetical market. It had already put thousands of students inside hundreds of companies, and it had the receipts to prove it. In the quarter ending March 2015, the company reportedly generated close to 3 crore rupees in revenue, with margins being around 20%. For a logistics-heavy business involving buses, permissions, corporate coordination, and student safety, that kind of margin was compelling enough to bring in a far bigger name. And in April 2015, Matrix Partners India led an investment of 12 crores into Purple Squirrel, marking Matrix's very first bet in the Indian education technology space. This wasn't a token check from a fund dabbling on the side. It was a firm with serious capital under management, staking a claim on the belief that Purple Squirrel had found something structurally unique in a crowded edtech landscape still dominated by video lectures and test prep content. But a venture check of that size fundamentally changes the physics of a startup. It is a mandate for hypergrowth. With Matrix on the board, the operational target shifted dramatically. The new goal was to hit 30 crores in annualized revenue. So, riding that credibility and armed with the fresh capital, the company scaled aggressively through the following months. Its footprint grew to claim partnerships with more than 450 companies and reach students across 100+ colleges. They were still concentrated around their core of 10 cities, but with meaningful, deeper penetration inside each one. To support this massive revenue target, they began building the infrastructure of a much larger machine, ballooning their operational headcount to approximately 120 employees. Purple Squirrel was, by most external measures, exactly the kind of company venture investors dream about backing early. A founding team with real domain conviction, a product solving widely acknowledged and painfully real problems, and a business model that on paper appeared to convert operational execution directly into revenue. Purple Squirrel looked like it was riding an unstoppable upward curve. But this is where things started to take a turn.
Act 3. The Crack.
Now, when you take venture capital and commit to a 30 crore revenue target, one would assume that your growth engine was perfectly tuned. But here is the major blind spot in Purple Squirrel's business model. Its revenue was tethered directly to the Indian academic calendar. Industrial visits and campus workshops cluster around specific windows in the college year, generally the months when students are neither buried in coursework nor sitting for exams. Once that window closes, it closes for months at a stretch, and there is structurally very little for Purple Squirrel to sell. It isn't a software subscription that quietly earns money in the background every single day. It is a physical logistics business that earns almost all of its revenue in bursts and goes nearly dormant in between. But Matrix hadn't just handed over 12 crores and stepped back to watch. The firm had reportedly tied its next round of funding to a specific milestone: 15 crores in revenue by September 2015. For Purple Squirrel, that number wasn't just a suggestion. It was the difference between a Series B and running out of runway. And it meant the company needed to find volume and find it fast from a customer base that hadn't actually asked to be scaled that quickly. The first problem was one the sales team had been running into from the very beginning. Turning the idea into an actual booking had never been that easy. They went out to colleges with brochures, pitching professors and student bodies directly. And more often than not, they were turned away outright. Even when a professor bought in, the students frequently didn't. As one former employee put it, students weren't interested in learning on these trips. They wanted vacation in Manali and Goa, not Hyderabad and Chennai. Every time a faculty member said yes, the students themselves would veto it. It's a strange kind of resistance for an education startup to face, not from the institutions or competition, but from the very students they were trying to educate. So eventually, Purple Squirrel decided to give them what they wanted. Chasing revenue targets on that kind of calendar meant chasing volume anywhere they could find. And if students were more excited about a beach than a boardroom, the company started leaning into trips to popular tourist destinations. It was less about the factory floors and more about getting bodies on buses. The solution was immediate, but it also put them in direct competition with the travel agents that already catered to these trips. Agents who bought hotel inventory in bulk and could undercut on price in a way Purple Squirrel, without the same volume, simply couldn't match. To stay competitive, the company started burning its own cash just to hold its pricing. The 20% margins that had impressed investors a few months earlier began quietly disappearing. So by September, the number Matrix was waiting for still hadn't arrived. In fact, the company supposedly managed to reach less than a third of that 15 crore milestone. So Matrix declined to lead a new round, and the planned Series B quietly fell apart. With fundraising stalled and the clock running, the co-founders pivoted into what insiders would later describe as a hit and hope phase, rushing out features rather than fixing fundamentals. An example would be a LinkedIn-style profile tool that let students list their skills like a digital resume. This was built and launched without any user testing or a focus group on a feature that, even if it worked perfectly, wouldn't generate meaningful revenue until it had scaled to a critical mass of its own. At the same time, the company was trying to lock down multi-year contracts with colleges to smooth out exactly the seasonality problem. But they ran straight into another structural wall. Colleges wanted firm commitments, basically names of companies and the exact dates. But most large corporates couldn't offer that. Fortune 500 manufacturers with live factory floors typically couldn't confirm a visit until 45 days out, since a sudden change in production orders could shut down a plan to visitors with little to no warning. And the mid-sized companies that could commit further in advance weren't glamorous enough for a college prospectus. Nobody wanted to advertise a trip to an unnamed auto ancillary supplier when a rival college would say its students had walked the floors of Tata or Mahindra. Then by December 2015, the dormant stretch of the calendar arrived right on schedule, now colliding with a company that had no fresh capital and no viable pivot. The industrial visit season was winding down, exam season was fast approaching, and cash flow, which had looked so robust just months earlier, slowed down to a bare trickle. The founders called an emergency meeting to figure out their options. In January 2016, they even managed to secure a bridge round of roughly 2 crores from existing investors, a lifeline meant to buy them some time. To stem the bleeding further, the company laid off around 40 employees out of a staff that had bloated by the mandate to scale at all costs. The math behind the panic was stark. By this point, the company had only about 3 crores left in the bank against a monthly burn rate of 1.2 crores. That's barely 2.5 months of runway, sitting directly on top of the least productive stretch of the entire academic calendar. With the internal numbers no longer adding up, the founders quietly began exploring a sale. They approached a couple prominent tour operators, businesses that already understood the mechanics of moving groups of people across cities and might, in theory, see value in Purple Squirrel's network of corporate and campus relationships. But the strategic synergy was non-existent from the start. A tour operator that makes its margins sending families on European vacations is fundamentally incompatible with the liability and duty of care required to handhold teenagers through industrial factory floors. The two businesses simply didn't share a customer, a service model, or a reason to exist inside the same company. The acquisition conversations went nowhere, and there were simply no more levers left to pull.
Act 4. The Fade.
So finally, in April 2016, with no meaningful way to generate revenue, no fallback product line to lean on, the runway effectively gone, and no acquirer in sight, Aditya Gandhi and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗙𝗵𝗲 made the decision to shut down Purple Squirrel. So, if we run its quiet collapse through the Sutra framework, there are some useful insights that emerge. Let's start with the obvious. The one thing that nobody could control. The kshetra, or the field the company operated in, which came with its own built-in rhythm. Students go on industrial visits only during specific windows in the academic year. This wasn't a hidden risk, nor a reason for any business to fail. The real test here was whether the business built on top of that terrain was actually designed for it. And this is where the yantra, the product itself, breaks down. Purple Squirrel had built something genuinely good, a differentiated, high-margin offering that solved a real, well-documented problem. But a product is more than the experience it delivers. It's also the business model wrapped around that experience. And that's precisely where the design fell short. In order to tackle seasonality, they could have supplemented their revenue stream with a second product offering, engineered precisely to fill the downtime. It could have been tutoring, corporate training, placement support, anything that could generate income in the very months the core business went quiet. Purple Squirrel never built that second engine, and so every lean month became a countdown rather than a pause. And a very short countdown too, especially considering how the company had the operational footprint of a business that expected steady monthly revenue. This is where the yantra bleeds directly into the tantra, the internal machinery running underneath the business. Because a company designed for bursts of revenue needs to be built like a company that only earns money for a few months of a year, with a cost base, a hiring plan, and a growth trajectory shaped around that reality. In order to chase revenue targets, Purple Squirrel scaled its operations to a point where the unit economics no longer made sense. Which takes us directly to 𝗧𝗵𝗲. That 20% margin in the March 2015 quarter was real, and it reflected real operational discipline. But if you stretch that margin across a full 12 months, that includes several unproductive ones, the picture changes entirely. It's all about the weakest link, and Purple Squirrel planned its future around its strongest one. A monthly cash burn of 1.2 crores for a company that made 3 crores in revenue in a single strong quarter is simply a case of mismanagement. A genuinely sustainable version of this business would have treated its seasonal dip as a known cost to plan for, not an emergency to react to. Which brings the story back to the people who are supposed to be watching all of this unfold, which is the Sangha. Matrix's decision to tie its next round of funding to a 15 crore milestone by September wasn't unreasonable on its own. Investors are entitled to ask for proof of progress. But it's worth noticing what that milestone did to the company's decision-making in the months that followed. Instead of pausing to ask whether that number was even the right target for a business with this particular shape, the founders spent the second half of 2015 chasing that very number by any means available, be it discounting into tourist trips that gutted their own margins, or shipping an unrequested LinkedIn-style feature without so much as a monetization plan. All of it aimed less at building a durable company and more at satisfying a milestone set by people who weren't the ones who had to live with the seasonal reality of the business. That's the uncomfortable truth about Sangha in this story. It's about two very qualified founders who let VC ambitions, however well-intentioned, override their own read of the business underneath them. But zoom out far enough, and Purple Squirrel was never really just a startup story. It was an early, imperfect attempt at something India's education system is still only just beginning to reckon with. The slow, overdue shift from rote, bookish learning towards something that actually resembles the world students are being trained for. For generations, the Indian classroom rewarded memory over application, marks over meaning, the right answer over the right understanding. But that's finally starting to change, in fits and starts, through internships, project-based curricula, and yes, the occasional bus ride to a factory floor. Purple Squirrel simply arrived a little too early with a business model that hadn't caught up to the idea it was chasing. Which leaves us with a thought worth pondering. The most important lessons are rarely the ones you ever write down for an exam. They're the ones you learn through experience. So somewhere between the classroom and everything that came after, what's the one lesson that stayed with you? We're asking because here at the Flop Side, we're basically just collecting these lessons, one story at a time, and sharing them with you every Friday. And that's your field trip wrapped for the week. No permission slips, just the hard lessons. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you're subscribed to The Flop Side so you don't miss what's coming next. Before we board the bus back, here's a final tidbit for your sticky notes. Germany's famous Ausbildung system, the dual apprenticeship model, where students split their time between classroom instruction and paid hands-on work inside actual companies, traces its roots all the way back to the medieval craft guilds, where master tradesmen trained apprentices directly on the job, centuries before anyone called it an education system. Today, over 1 million young Germans are enrolled in it every year, learning trades across more than 300 recognized professions. And it's a big part of why the country has one of the lowest youth unemployment rates in Europe. Now, if you've got a startup that tried to fix a very real problem or a college field trip story of your own, find us on Instagram at theflopside.podcast. I'm your host Priyanka, and I'm here with my co-creator Nandita. We'd like to thank you for hanging out with us this week on The Flop Side, where we show you the flip side of flop startups.